The cabin is worth $285,000 today, Maggie, and if you walk away from that offer because of Grandpa's memories, do not expect the rest of us to pretend it makes sense. My brother David said it across the kitchen table as if the decision had already been made and my signature was merely the final piece of paperwork. I was 59 years old, had spent most of my working life as an administrative coordinator for a medical supply company in Knoxville, and had learned one habit that had saved me from more mistakes than I could count: I read before I signed. That afternoon, however, everyone seemed to think reading was unnecessary. David sat across from me with his wife, Susan, while our cousin Rachel stood near the counter pouring coffee. Between us was a purchase proposal from Blue Ridge Heritage Development for Grandpa Walter's cabin and the land surrounding it, roughly 18 acres of hardwood forest about 50 miles east of Knoxville. The offer was $285,000. On paper, I understood why David liked it. The cabin was only about 900 square feet. Its cedar siding had faded to gray-brown, the covered porch leaned slightly toward one corner, the plumbing needed attention, and the old tin roof would probably need replacement within a few years. Nobody had lived there full-time since Grandpa died at 87. Still, when he left the property to me, I never considered it worthless. Grandpa Walter Hayes had purchased the cabin decades earlier, then spent years maintaining the surrounding land with the same patience he used when building furniture. He had been a carpenter before becoming a maintenance supervisor, and he believed anything worth owning was worth understanding. "It is an old cabin, Maggie," David said. Nobody is insulting Grandpa by admitting that. I did not say anyone was. Then what is the problem? I looked down at the proposal again. The representative from Blue Ridge Heritage Development, a man named Eric Lawson, had visited the property 2 days earlier. He had been polite, professional, and unusually interested in the eastern side of the acreage. He asked about the gravel drive, the tree line, and whether I knew exactly where the property reached County Road 14. At the time, I assumed he was checking access for construction equipment. But something about the question stayed with me. "Why do they want this property?" I asked. David leaned back. "Because developers buy land." "I understand that. Why this land?" "They are planning some kind of mountain residential project nearby." Rachel turned from the counter. "Maybe vacation homes." "The proposal says future residential development," I said. "It does not explain why they need Grandpa's parcel." David gave Susan a look that made both of them smile. It was not cruel, but I knew what it meant. Maggie was complicating something simple again. "They offered nearly $300,000 for a cabin that needs $50,000 of work," David said. "That is why they want it. That explains why you want to sell it. It does not explain why they want to buy it." Rachel stopped stirring her coffee. "That is actually a fair question." David sighed. "Fine. Ask them. Then sign." I closed the folder. "I am not signing today." David laughed once, quietly. I knew this was about Grandpa. Of course Grandpa matters. He left me the property. Exactly. You spent half your childhood up there. Thanksgiving weekends, fishing trips, sitting on that porch while Grandpa told stories. I understand the emotional attachment, but sentiment does not change market value. I looked through the kitchen window toward the bare November trees. David was right about one thing. The cabin carried memories. Grandpa teaching me how to sand a table without damaging the grain. Grandpa waking before sunrise and making coffee strong enough to wake the entire county. Grandpa walking the property with an old canvas jacket and folded maps in his pocket. But one memory had been bothering me since Eric Lawson's visit. Years earlier, I had asked Grandpa why he kept paying taxes on wooded acreage he barely used. He had looked toward the ridge and said, "Never judge a piece of land by the house sitting on it." At 25, I thought he was giving me another one of his practical sayings. At 59, with a purchase agreement sitting in front of me, I wondered whether he had meant something more specific. David pushed the folder toward me again. $285,000, Maggie. You could put the money into retirement and never worry about repairing that place again. Maybe. Then what are we waiting for? Information. His expression changed. What information? I want to know exactly what I own before I sell it. Susan spoke gently. Surely the deed tells you that. Then reading the deed should not cause a problem. David shook his head. You are going to lose a good offer because you cannot let go. I picked up the folder and stood. If the offer is good after I understand the property, I can consider it then. The next morning, I drove east toward the cabin. The highway narrowed as the hills rose around me, and by the time I turned onto the gravel road, the November air had become cold enough to frost the shaded ground. The cabin appeared between the trees exactly as I remembered it, weathered cedar, stone chimney, old porch, nothing that looked remotely like a $285,000 opportunity. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar smell of pine, old wood, and dust greeted me. I had come for the deed, but I knew Grandpa kept property records in a metal file box beneath the desk in the back room. I found the box exactly where I remembered. Inside were tax receipts, insurance papers, repair invoices, several deeds, and folded surveys secured with an old rubber band. On top was a yellowed envelope in Grandpa's handwriting. It contained no letter, only a handwritten note attached to an old property map. I unfolded the map across the desk. Grandpa had marked several boundary lines in pencil. The eastern edge immediately caught my attention. A narrow strip of land extended farther toward County Road 14 than the boundary shown on the developer's map. I checked it again, certain I had misunderstood. I had not. Two maps describing the same property showed something different, and suddenly I remembered another thing Grandpa used to tell me whenever paperwork seemed too boring to matter. Paper remembers what people forget. I stayed at the cabin for nearly 3 hours that morning, and the longer I looked through Grandpa Walter's records, the less comfortable I became with the idea of signing anything. The old survey on the desk was dated almost 22 years earlier. It showed the main 18-acre parcel surrounding the cabin, but the eastern boundary did not end where the map from Blue Ridge Heritage Development suggested. Instead, a narrow piece of property extended through the trees toward County Road 14. It was not wide enough to look important on paper, which may have been why I had never paid attention to it before. I found another survey beneath a stack of tax receipts. That one was older, and the narrow strip was missing entirely. Then I found a third document showing a small parcel added later. None of it made enough sense for me to draw conclusions, but it was enough to make me certain of one thing: Grandpa's property history was more complicated than David believed. I photographed the documents with my phone and carefully returned everything to the metal box. Before leaving, I walked outside and followed the eastern tree line. The ground sloped gently downhill through mature oak and maple trees. After several hundred feet, I found an old fence line nearly swallowed by vines. Farther down was a rusted metal survey marker beside a large stone. I could hear traffic faintly through the woods. County Road 14 was closer than I had realized. I stood there remembering Eric Lawson's questions during his visit. He had asked whether I knew where the eastern boundary reached the road. At the time, it sounded like ordinary due diligence. Now it sounded considerably more specific. My phone rang before I reached the cabin again. It was David. "Did you find the deed?" he asked. "I found several things." "Good. Then maybe we can get this finished." "Not yet." There was a pause. "Maggie, what are you doing?" "Trying to understand Grandpa's property records." "You own 18 acres and a cabin. What is there to understand?" "Apparently more than we thought." I told him about the surveys. He became quiet for perhaps 2 seconds before dismissing them. "Old surveys change. Roads change. Parcel lines get updated. Property boundaries do not move just because somebody prints a newer map." "You are not a surveyor." "Exactly. That is why I am not pretending I know what these documents mean." He sighed. "This is what I was worried about. You found some old papers and now you are turning them into a mystery. I am checking records before selling land. You are delaying a good offer. Those are not the same thing. When I returned to Knoxville that afternoon, David and Susan were waiting at my house. Rachel arrived 20 minutes later after David called her. I spread copies of the surveys across my dining table. David barely looked at them. This one is more than 20 years old, he said. Yes. And this one is even older. Yes. So why would you trust these instead of the current map? I do not trust either one yet. I want to know why they are different. Susan leaned closer. What is this narrow section? That is what I want to find out. David looked at it and shrugged. Probably an old access lane. Maybe. Then there you go. Rachel pulled the developer's map closer and placed it beside Grandpa's survey. Wait. Maggie is right. This does not match. David rubbed his forehead. We are talking about a strip of woods. We are talking about property somebody wants to buy, I said. There is a difference. He looked directly at me. You are going to make this impossible, are you not? No. I am going to make it informed. David leaned back and gave a short laugh. Grandpa kept everything. Receipts from 20 years ago, old maps, tax bills, probably instructions for appliances he did not even own anymore. You cannot assume every piece of paper means something. I am not assuming anything. Then sell the cabin. Not until I know what I am selling. The room went quiet. Susan eventually asked whether I planned to contact the developer. I said no, not yet. First, I wanted records that had not come from Grandpa and had not come from Blue Ridge Heritage Development. Rachel suggested the county property office. That was exactly what I had been thinking. The following Monday morning, I drove to the county administrative building with photographs of the surveys, a copy of Grandpa's deed, and the parcel number from my tax statement. The clerk at the records counter helped me locate the current parcel information, then directed me toward archived plats and older recorded transfers. I expected to spend an hour confirming that Grandpa's survey was outdated. Instead, I spent most of the morning discovering how little I knew about land I had inherited. The current tax map showed the cabin parcel, but when I asked about the eastern boundary, the clerk enlarged the digital record. A narrow extension appeared exactly where Grandpa's survey showed it. Is that part of my parcel? I asked. She studied the screen. It appears connected, but you will want the recorded instruments to understand how it got there. She gave me several reference numbers. One led to a deed recorded 18 years earlier. Another went back 26 years. A third was older still. Grandpa's name appeared repeatedly. He had not simply bought the cabin and 18 acres in one transaction. Over the years, he had acquired additional pieces of adjoining land. Some were so small that I could not understand why anyone would bother buying them. One transfer described less than an acre. Another concerned a long, narrow tract extending eastward. I was copying the recording information when an older man at the neighboring workstation glanced at the plat on my screen. His employee badge identified him as Thomas Green. That is an interesting parcel, he said. Why? He pointed toward the narrow eastern tract without touching the screen. Because pieces shaped like that usually exist for a reason. I looked again at the thin line running toward County Road 14. What kind of reason? Thomas pulled a chair closer and studied the recording numbers. Then he said something that made me stop writing. Before you worry about what that land is worth, you might want to find out what it connects. Thomas Green did not tell me what the narrow tract connected to. Instead, he showed me how to find out for myself. He had worked with county mapping records for decades and was helping at the public records counter that morning, but he was careful not to interpret ownership questions as legal advice. Start with the recorded deeds, he said. Maps are useful, but the deeds tell you how the pieces moved. We pulled the first reference number the clerk had given me. It was a transfer recorded 26 years earlier, when Grandpa Walter purchased a little more than half an acre from a neighboring landowner named Harold Mercer. The description meant almost nothing to me at first. Bearings, distances, iron pins, corners, and references to older plats filled most of the page. Thomas helped me locate the corresponding survey. On that drawing, the small parcel looked like an awkward wedge attached to the eastern side of Grandpa's original acreage. Why would he buy that? I asked. Thomas shrugged. Could have been to straighten a boundary. Could have been drainage. Could have been access. Keep going. The next deed was recorded 8 years later. Grandpa had purchased another narrow section from the Mercer family, this one stretching farther east. Then came a third transaction several years after that. Each purchase was small. None looked impressive by itself. But when Thomas helped me place the historical plats in chronological order, something became obvious. Grandpa had been assembling a continuous strip of land. He did this deliberately, I said. It certainly looks organized, Thomas replied. But do not decide why until you have the rest of the records. That sentence sounded exactly like something Grandpa would have said. I copied every deed and plat I could find. Then Thomas opened the county geographic information system and displayed the surrounding parcels. Grandpa's property sat on one side of a much larger wooded tract extending toward the ridge. The eastern strip reached in the opposite direction, toward County Road 14. I stared at the screen. What is behind my property? Thomas clicked the adjoining parcel. The tract contained more than 100 acres. The ownership information showed a limited liability company I did not recognize. Is that Blue Ridge Heritage Development? I asked. I cannot tell you who controls the company from this screen. You would need to check business records or ask the developer. The coincidence was enough to make me uncomfortable. I photographed the parcel information and thanked him. Before I left, Thomas pointed to one more notation on an older plat. You should have a surveyor explain this. What is it? It appears to reference access, but I would rather not guess from an old scan. That was the moment I realized how easily I could make the same mistake I had accused David of making. He had looked at a cabin and assumed he understood its value. I could look at an old map and invent a secret that was not there. I needed facts. Outside the county building, I called Rachel. Grandpa bought additional pieces of land. How many? At least 3 transactions after the original cabin purchase. Why? I do not know yet. Does David know? Not yet. Rachel was quiet for a moment. You should probably tell him before he hears it from somebody else. She was right. That evening, David and Susan came to my house. I placed copies of the deeds across the dining table in chronological order. David studied them longer than he had studied the surveys. These purchases are tiny, he finally said. Some are. This one is less than an acre. Yes. So Grandpa spent money buying scraps of woods. That is one way to describe it. David looked irritated. Maggie, I am trying to understand what you think this proves. Nothing yet. Then why are we doing this? Because the developer asked about the eastern boundary before I knew there was anything unusual about the eastern boundary. Susan looked up immediately. They specifically asked about it. Several times. David frowned. Developers ask about access. Exactly. I placed the county parcel map beside the deeds. And Grandpa spent years buying a strip that reaches toward County Road 14. David examined the map. His expression changed slightly, but he recovered quickly. Maybe Grandpa wanted another driveway. Maybe. Maybe the original access was unreliable. Maybe. Then there is no mystery. I never said there was. David pushed his chair back. You are treating ordinary property records like clues. I am treating them like records. Susan picked up the most recent deed. David, why are you so bothered by her checking? He looked at her. Because the offer has a deadline. That was new information. What deadline? I asked. David hesitated. Eric called me this afternoon. Blue Ridge wants an answer by Friday. I stared at him. Why is Eric calling you? Because you have not returned his calls. That does not make you the owner. I never said it did. What exactly did he ask? David crossed his arms. Whether you were still considering the offer. Anything else? Another hesitation. He asked whether you had ordered a new survey. The room became silent. Rachel had been right about one thing. The old documents might mean nothing unusual. But the developer's question did. The next morning, I called Eric Lawson myself. He sounded pleased to hear from me until I asked why Blue Ridge cared whether I commissioned a survey. Standard due diligence, he said. Then you will not mind if I complete it before responding to your offer. There was a pause long enough for me to notice. Mrs. Carter, the current offer is based on the property as represented in our preliminary review. Then a survey should only make that representation clearer. He changed the subject and reminded me that the offer expired Friday. I thanked him and ended the call. 10 minutes later, I contacted a licensed surveyor recommended by the county office. I sent him the recorded deeds and historical plats. He called me back that afternoon. Mrs. Carter, I cannot give you a conclusion until I examine the title documents and field evidence, but I can tell you something from these plats. What? Your grandfather did not acquire those eastern parcels randomly. Whatever his reason was, those purchases created a continuous route from the main property toward the county road. The surveyor's name was Daniel Foster, and when he met me at the cabin 2 days later, he carried a field tablet, surveying equipment, and copies of the same plats I had found in Grandpa Walter's metal file box. The morning was cold and clear, with frost still clinging to the shaded leaves along the gravel drive. Daniel spent almost an hour establishing reference points before he asked me to walk toward the eastern boundary with him. I followed several feet behind as he moved through the trees, stopping periodically to compare measurements with the recorded descriptions. Eventually, we reached the rusted marker I had noticed on my previous visit. Daniel examined it, checked his equipment, then continued downhill. This corresponds with one of the older monuments, he said. So Grandpa's survey was accurate. So far, the field evidence is consistent with it. I still need to complete the work before I certify anything. We continued through the woods until the narrow track became easier to understand physically. It was not a road. There was no pavement and no maintained driveway, only a long strip of forest extending toward County Road 14. But unlike the surrounding terrain, it provided a relatively direct route between the main acreage and the public road. Would this be considered access? I asked. Daniel looked toward the slope. Ownership and legal access are related but different questions. Your attorney should review the title. What I can tell you is that these recorded parcels appear to form a continuous property connection. That distinction mattered. I did not want another assumption replacing the first one. By noon, Daniel had located additional markers and told me he would need several days to prepare a preliminary survey. Before leaving, he pointed toward the wooded ridge beyond Grandpa's property. Do you know who owns the large tract behind you? The county map lists a limited liability company. You might want your attorney to look at that too. I did not have a real estate attorney, so Rachel recommended Laura Mitchell, a Knoxville lawyer who handled property transactions and title matters. I called her that afternoon. Laura agreed to review the deeds, surveys, purchase proposal, and county records before advising me. Her first question was simple. Have you signed anything with Blue Ridge Heritage Development? No. Good. Keep it that way until we understand the title. On Friday morning, the day Blue Ridge said its offer would expire, Eric Lawson called again. Mrs. Carter, I wanted to make sure you understood that the $285,000 offer closes at 5 this afternoon. I understand. Are you prepared to move forward? No. He paused. May I ask why? I am completing a survey and title review. The friendliness in his voice became more careful. Our preliminary title work did not identify anything that should prevent a sale. I am not trying to prevent a sale. Then perhaps we can extend the deadline for a few days. That interested me. 3 days earlier, the deadline had sounded absolute. Now that he knew I was reviewing the property, it suddenly became flexible. I appreciate that, I said, but I am not negotiating until my review is finished. After the call, David arrived at my house furious about the expired offer. You actually let it go. I declined to sign it. That is the same thing. No, it is not. They already offered to extend the deadline. David stopped. They did. Immediately after I mentioned the survey. Susan, standing beside him, looked at me. That is strange. David shook his head. Or they simply want the property. Then waiting for accurate records should not frighten them. He paced toward the window. You are risking $285,000 over a strip of trees. You keep saying that number as if somebody deposited it into my account. It was an offer for property we do not fully understand. You mean property you do not understand? Correct. That is why I am learning. Susan sat at the table and picked up one of Grandpa's old plats. What did the surveyor say? The parcels appear to create a continuous connection toward County Road 14. He will not certify anything until the survey is complete. David looked at me. And what exactly do you think Grandpa was doing? I do not know. That answer frustrated him more than any theory could have. After all this, you still do not know. No. But not knowing is not a reason to sell before I find out. The following Tuesday, I met Laura Mitchell in her office. She had already reviewed the recorded deeds and ordered a title search. On her conference table she arranged Grandpa's purchases chronologically. The original cabin parcel came first. Then the small wedge from Harold Mercer. Then the longer eastern tract. Finally, another narrow acquisition completed the connection toward the county road. Your grandfather assembled this over approximately 15 years, Laura said. Does that mean he wanted road access? It suggests intentional acquisition, but I want more evidence before assigning motive. She turned to the purchase proposal. What concerns me more is the legal description Blue Ridge attached. She placed it beside Grandpa's most recent deed. The developer's offer covered the entire property, including the narrow eastern tract. So they know it is there. Their title people almost certainly do. Then why does their presentation map make it look insignificant? Presentation maps are not deeds. She leaned back. Maggie, I also checked the company owning the large tract behind your property. My stomach tightened. And? It was acquired 18 months ago by an entity affiliated with Blue Ridge Heritage Development. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The cabin was not an isolated property they happened to like. Their land sat directly behind mine. Laura pulled up a county road map and positioned it beside the parcel map. Their larger tract has another potential route toward a public road, but it crosses steeper terrain and appears substantially longer. I am not saying your corridor is necessary for their project. We would need engineering and land use information to determine that. But it might be useful. Very useful, potentially. I thought about Eric asking where the eastern boundary reached County Road 14 before I even knew the narrow tract existed. So what do we do now? Laura closed the folder. We continue doing exactly what you have been doing. We verify instead of guessing. Then she handed me a copy of one of Grandpa's older deeds. Attached to it was a reference I had overlooked at the county office, a notation pointing to another recorded instrument from the same year. What is that? I asked. That, Laura said, is what I want to retrieve next, because it may explain why your grandfather started buying those strips in the first place. Laura retrieved the referenced instrument from the county archives the following morning, and when she called me, her voice was measured rather than excited. I found the document, Maggie. It does not answer everything, but it gives us context. I drove to her office after lunch. On the conference table was a copy of an agreement recorded 26 years earlier between Grandpa Walter and Harold Mercer, the neighbor who had sold him the first small parcel. The document concerned boundary access and maintenance between their properties. It was not some hidden contract promising future riches. In fact, most of it was painfully ordinary. It described an old farm lane, responsibilities for maintaining a drainage ditch, and the location of several boundary markers. But attached to the filing was a survey sketch showing something I had never seen clearly before. The old farm lane ran east toward County Road 14. So Grandpa bought land along this lane? I asked. That appears to be what happened over time, Laura said. The first purchase improved his connection to it. The later acquisitions extended his ownership farther toward the public road. Why would he need that when the cabin already had a gravel driveway? That is the question. She showed me the original access serving the cabin from the west. It crossed uneven terrain and followed a narrow road that had existed for decades. Grandpa had never been landlocked. The eastern route was not necessary for ordinary access to the cabin. Then he was protecting something, I said. Laura raised a hand slightly. Possibly. But remember what we agreed. Evidence first. Daniel Foster's preliminary survey arrived that afternoon. His measurements confirmed that the eastern parcels described in Grandpa's deeds formed a continuous strip under the same ownership as the cabin property. The exact width varied along the route, but the connection reached the vicinity of County Road 14. Daniel also confirmed that the terrain was significantly gentler than portions of the alternate route serving the large tract behind my land. None of that proved Blue Ridge needed my property, but it made Eric Lawson's repeated interest harder to dismiss. I returned to the cabin the next day because I wanted to search Grandpa's files again. This time I stopped looking for deeds and started looking for correspondence. Grandpa had organized his papers by year in manila folders, usually with handwritten labels. Taxes. Insurance. Repairs. Mercer property. Road. The folder marked road contained receipts for gravel, drainage work, and several letters exchanged with neighboring owners. Near the back was a single sheet of yellow legal paper in Grandpa's handwriting. It was not addressed to anyone. It appeared to be a note he had written for himself after one of the later land purchases. His handwriting had faded, but I could still read it. He wrote that neighboring timber acreage might eventually change hands and that keeping independent access to the county road would prevent future owners from controlling how the Hayes property could be approached from the east. He also wrote that land should never depend entirely on the plans of whoever happened to own the property next door. I read those sentences 3 times. Grandpa had not predicted Blue Ridge heritage development. He had not secretly known that a developer would arrive decades later. He had simply understood that neighboring ownership changes, roads change, and access matters. That realization was somehow more satisfying than discovering an elaborate secret plan. Grandpa had done what he always did. He had thought ahead. My phone rang while I was sitting at his old desk. David's name appeared on the screen. Eric called again, he said when I answered. Why is he still calling you? Because I answered the first time, I suppose. He says Blue Ridge is willing to increase the offer. I sat straighter. To what? $325,000. A $40,000 increase after their supposedly firm deadline had expired. Did you ask why? Because they want to close the deal. That is not an explanation. David sounded exhausted. Maggie, most people would be happy when somebody increases an offer. I am happy to have more information. There you go again. Did Eric mention the Eastern Strip? Silence. David. He asked whether your survey confirmed road frontage. I looked down at Grandpa's handwritten note. And what did you tell him? That I did not know. Good. I am not trying to interfere, Maggie. His voice softened. I just think you are letting suspicion take over. I am sitting at Grandpa's desk reading a note explaining why he bought those parcels. David became quiet. What does it say? I read the relevant lines aloud. When I finished, there was no immediate response. So he wanted another access route, David finally said. He wanted to protect the property's independence. That still does not make it worth more than $325,000. I did not say it did. Then what are you saying? I am saying Blue Ridge knows about that corridor, and they increased their offer before I even asked them about it. David exhaled slowly. What happens now? Laura finishes the title review. Then we find out what Blue Ridge is actually planning. 2 days later, Laura called me back to Knoxville. She had obtained publicly available planning materials associated with the large tract behind Grandpa's property. Blue Ridge had submitted preliminary concepts for a residential mountain development. The documents were early stage and subject to review, but the proposed internal road system was visible. Laura placed the concept plan beside the county parcel map. One proposed road ended near the western side of their tract, where the terrain descended toward another public route. It was possible, but long and steep. Another conceptual connection pointed toward the boundary nearest Grandpa's eastern corridor. Does this mean they need my land? I asked. No, Laura said. And we should not claim that. They may have other engineering options. But your property could provide a shorter and potentially more practical connection to County Road 14. So the cabin is not what they are after. I cannot tell you what they are after until they tell us. But I can tell you that your eastern corridor has potential strategic value that the original offer never explained. She slid the purchase agreement toward me and tapped the legal description. If you had signed this, you would not have sold an old cabin with some woods around it. You would have transferred the cabin, the acreage, and every parcel your grandfather spent years assembling, including the one piece that may be especially useful to the development next door. I thought about David laughing at the old surveys, and then about myself nearly believing the developer's map because it looked newer and cleaner than Grandpa's papers. What do we do? I asked. Laura closed the agreement. We stopped discussing their price for a moment and asked a much more important question. She turned the development concept toward me. What would their project look like if they did not own your corridor? Laura did not try to answer her own question that afternoon. Instead, she recommended that I speak with someone who could evaluate the practical differences between the possible access routes without pretending that a preliminary development plan was final. She referred me to a land use consultant named Robert Ellis, who had worked on residential projects throughout East Tennessee. 3 days later, Robert met Laura and me at her office with Daniel Foster's preliminary survey, county topographic maps, and the planning documents Blue Ridge Heritage Development had submitted. He studied them quietly for nearly 20 minutes before speaking. There are several things we cannot know without the developer's engineering plans, he said. But we can compare what is visible. He pointed to the western side of Blue Ridge's large tract. They appear to have potential access here, so I would not say your property is their only route. Then he moved his finger toward Grandpa's eastern corridor. But this route is shorter, and the terrain appears considerably less difficult. If it can satisfy county requirements, it could be valuable. How valuable? I asked. Robert smiled slightly. That is the question everyone asks too early. Strategic value depends on what it saves the other party, what approvals are possible, what restrictions exist, and whether alternatives are practical. You need an appraisal that considers the land's contribution to a potential access arrangement, not just the cabin and acreage as ordinary rural property. Laura nodded. Which is what I expected. Robert then explained something that finally made the situation clear to me. Blue Ridge did not necessarily need to own all 18 acres to benefit from the corridor. Depending on engineering and county approval, they might seek an easement allowing a defined road across part of my property. That meant the choice was not simply sell everything or refuse everything. There could be another option. I thought about Grandpa's note saying land should never depend entirely on the plans of whoever owned the neighboring property. He had spent years creating independence, and I had almost surrendered all of it because everyone around me thought $285,000 sounded impressive. The following evening, I invited David, Susan, and Rachel to my house. I wanted them to hear what I had learned before rumors or assumptions filled the gaps. I placed the survey, title documents, and development concept on the dining table. Before anybody says anything, I told them, I want to be clear about what we know and what we do not know. David folded his arms but remained quiet. We know Grandpa bought 3 adjoining pieces over the years. We know those purchases created a continuous corridor toward County Road 14. We know Blue Ridge owns the large tract behind Grandpa's property. We know their preliminary development concept shows possible road connections, including one near our boundary. We do not know whether they require Grandpa's corridor. We do not know what the county would approve. And we do not know its exact value. Rachel leaned over the map. But it could make their project easier. According to the consultant, potentially much easier. Susan looked at David. That explains why they kept asking about the eastern boundary. David did not answer immediately. Then he looked at me. And why they raised the offer? Possibly. I am not going to claim motive without asking them directly. So ask them. Laura already has. David's eyebrows lifted. Earlier that afternoon, Laura had sent Blue Ridge a formal request for clarification. She explained that the title review had confirmed the Eastern Corridor and asked whether their acquisition interest related to potential access for the adjoining development. We expected a carefully worded response. Instead, Eric Lawson called Laura less than 2 hours later and requested a meeting. That meeting took place the next morning. Eric arrived with another Blue Ridge representative named Michael Reeves. Laura sat beside me. They did not deny the importance of the corridor. Michael explained that Blue Ridge was evaluating several access configurations for the development and that acquiring my property would provide flexibility. So you were not offering $285,000 because you wanted my cabin, I said. Michael answered carefully. The offer reflected our interest in the property as a whole, including the Eastern Corridor. Yes. Why did nobody explain that when you presented the offer? Eric responded. Mrs. Carter, our proposal identified the legal property being purchased. We were not concealing the parcel description. Laura spoke before I could. Nobody is alleging concealment. We are establishing the commercial purpose behind the acquisition. Michael nodded. Then yes, access potential is one factor. There it was. Not a conspiracy. Not a hidden treasure. Just a fact they understood before I did. Blue Ridge knew Grandpa's land could make their development more flexible, while my family had been valuing the property as an old cabin surrounded by woods. Michael placed a new document on the table. Given the information now available, we are prepared to revise our proposal. The number was $450,000. A few weeks earlier, I might have considered it extraordinary. Now I did not even reach for the document. Is that an offer for the entire property? I asked. Yes. Then I am not interested. Eric looked surprised. You have not reviewed the terms. I do not need the terms to know I am not selling the entire property today. Michael leaned forward slightly. May I ask what you would consider? I looked at Laura. She gave me the smallest nod. An independent appraisal first. Then, if the facts support it, we can discuss limited access rather than transferring ownership of everything. Neither man answered immediately. That silence told me more than the new number had. When I told David about the meeting later that day, he stared at me across my kitchen table. They offered $450,000 and you still said no. To selling everything, yes. He laughed in disbelief, but this time the laughter sounded uncertain. Maggie, what number are you waiting for? I am not waiting for a number. Then what are you waiting for? I looked at Grandpa's old survey lying between us. For the first time since this started, I am asking the right question. Not how much they will pay for Grandpa's land, but how little of it I actually need to give up. The independent appraisal took nearly 2 weeks, and during that time I learned something about patience that Grandpa Walter probably understood long before I did. Once people know you possess something they want, silence becomes uncomfortable for them. Blue Ridge Heritage Development called Laura twice. Eric Lawson sent a revised summary of their interest. David called me almost every evening, usually beginning with a reasonable question and eventually circling back to the same number. $450,000. To him, refusing that offer seemed even more irrational than refusing the first one. I understood his reaction. Before the county records, the surveys, and the development plans, I might have felt exactly the same way. But now I knew that a larger offer did not automatically mean a fair offer. It only meant Blue Ridge had decided the property was worth more to them than they had initially offered. The appraisal was completed by a certified appraiser named James Holloway, who reviewed the cabin, the acreage, the recorded corridor, comparable rural properties, and the potential contribution of access to the neighboring development. He was careful about his conclusions. The cabin and surrounding acreage had one value as ordinary rural residential property. The eastern corridor created another consideration because of its location relative to Blue Ridge Tract and County Road 14. He could not promise what a developer would ultimately pay, and he could not guarantee that the county would approve a road. But his analysis supported what Laura had been telling me, treating the property as nothing more than 18 wooded acres with an aging cabin significantly understated its strategic position. When Laura explained the appraisal to me, I did not feel victorious. I felt relieved. I had spent weeks wondering whether I was being cautious or merely stubborn. Now I finally had independent evidence separating those two things. That Sunday, I invited David, Susan, and Rachel to the cabin. I wanted them to see the records where Grandpa had kept them rather than around my dining table in Knoxville. David arrived first. He walked onto the porch carrying coffee and looked around at the faded cedar siding. "Still looks like an old cabin," he said. There was humor in his voice this time rather than criticism. "It is an old cabin," I replied. "That was never the part we got wrong." Susan and Rachel arrived shortly afterward, and we gathered around Grandpa's wooden table. I laid out the original deed, the 3 later purchases, Daniel's survey, the county parcel map, Blue Ridge preliminary development concept, and the appraisal summary. David stared at the documents for several moments. "So what is the property worth?" he asked. "There is not one magical number," I said. "The appraisal gives a range depending on how the land is used and what rights are transferred." "Is it more than $450,000? "Potentially, if somebody is buying the entire property for strategic access. But that is not the point anymore." David looked confused. "How can that not be the point?" I placed Grandpa's handwritten note beside the map. "Because Blue Ridge does not necessarily need to own my cabin, my woods, and every acre Grandpa assembled just to create an access route." Rachel understood first. "You could grant an easement." "Possibly. If the county approves the route and the terms protect the property." Susan leaned toward the map. "So you could keep the cabin?" "Yes." "And most of the land?" "Yes." David sat back. For once, he did not immediately respond. I could see him recalculating the entire situation. "What would an easement be worth?" he finally asked. "That depends on its width, location, permitted use, construction impact, maintenance obligations, and what value it creates for their development. Laura will negotiate only after we understand those details." David looked down at Grandpa's old survey. "I thought you were refusing because you could not let go." "I know. And I kept telling everyone you were being emotional." "You did." He gave a small embarrassed smile. "You could enjoy this moment a little more. I am not trying to win against you." That surprised him. "Then what are you trying to do?" I thought about the question before answering. "Make sure I do not trade something permanent for a decision made under pressure." Rachel picked up one of the old deeds. "Grandpa bought these pieces over 15 years. Yes. And we were ready to sell all of them in an afternoon. Nobody said anything after that. The sentence did not need help. David eventually stood and walked to the porch. I followed him outside. Through the bare trees, the ridge was visible in the distance. "You know what bothers me," he said. "What?" "I really thought I was protecting you from making a bad financial decision." "I know you did. I saw repairs, taxes, and an offer that seemed too good to refuse. That was reasonable." He looked at me. "Then why did you see something different?" "I did not, at first. I just remembered Grandpa telling me never to judge land by the house sitting on it." David laughed quietly. "He said that to me too. Then I guess I was the one annoying enough to remember it at the right time." David smiled, but his expression quickly became serious again. "I was wrong to laugh at you. You were wrong to rush me." The laughing was just irritating. That earned a genuine laugh from both of us. The following Monday, Laura contacted Blue Ridge and informed them that I would not consider another offer for complete ownership. If they wanted to discuss a limited access easement, we were prepared to hear a proposal. Their response came the next morning. They wanted to negotiate. Laura warned me that this was where details mattered even more than price. A road easement could affect drainage, traffic, noise, maintenance, insurance, future development, and the long-term character of the cabin property. Every right granted needed boundaries. Every obligation needed language. Grandpa had protected the land by acquiring it carefully. I would have to protect it by negotiating just as carefully. Then Laura showed me the first draft Blue Ridge had submitted. The compensation number caught my attention, but another section mattered more. Their proposed easement was far broader than the narrow access arrangement we had discussed, with language that could allow future expansion. I read that paragraph twice, looked at Laura, and understood immediately why she had placed it in front of me first. The family had finally stopped laughing at my refusal to sign quickly, but the most important document in the entire story was now sitting on the table, and once again, the number on the first page was not the part one needed to read most carefully. The first draft from Blue Ridge offered enough money to make David stare at the page for several seconds when I showed it to him, but Laura had already taught me where to look first. The proposed easement was wider than the corridor we had discussed, and the language gave Blue Ridge considerable flexibility to modify, improve, and potentially expand the roadway in the future. It also placed several maintenance questions in language that Laura considered too vague. "If you sign this version," she told me, "you keep ownership of the land, but you give away more control than I think you understand from the compensation figure alone." A month earlier, that sentence might have frightened me. Now it simply made me reach for a pen and start taking notes. We went through the document line by line. I wanted a clearly defined maximum width. I wanted construction confined to the surveyed corridor rather than allowing Blue Ridge to shift the route wherever engineering became convenient. I wanted them responsible for construction, drainage, erosion control, road maintenance, and repairs caused by their use. Laura insisted on insurance requirements and indemnification language. Robert Ellis recommended limits preventing the easement from becoming an unrestricted route for unrelated future properties. Daniel Foster prepared a survey exhibit showing exactly where the permitted access could run. I also requested vegetative screening near the portion closest to the cabin and restrictions designed to preserve as much of the wooded character as reasonably possible. Eric Lawson objected to several conditions. "We need flexibility," he said during our next meeting. "And I need certainty," I replied. "You are asking for a permanent right across property I intend to keep." Michael Reeves explained that road design sometimes changes during county review. Laura proposed language allowing minor engineering adjustments within a defined envelope, but not unilateral expansion across additional acreage. That became the pattern of the negotiation. Blue Ridge asked for broad rights. Laura narrowed them. Their engineers requested practical flexibility. Robert helped distinguish reasonable construction needs from unnecessary control. I listened, asked questions, and refused to be embarrassed when I did not understand a term. The strangest part was realizing how different I felt from the woman who had sat at my kitchen table only weeks earlier while David told me the cabin was just an old building in the woods. I had not become a real estate expert. I had simply stopped believing that uncertainty meant I should surrender the decision to someone more confident. David surprised me during those negotiations. Instead of asking why I had not accepted the latest number, he began asking what the terms meant. One evening, he came to my house with Susan and read the revised easement at the dining table. "So this section means they maintain the road?" he asked. "Yes, according to Laura. And they cannot widen it beyond this limit without another agreement." "Correct." He nodded slowly. "That is better." I smiled. "Listen to you reading the fine print." He gave me a tired grin. "Apparently it runs in the family. Some of us just learned later." The compensation changed several times as the permitted rights became more specific. I will admit that watching those numbers move was tempting. But Laura reminded me that a permanent easement would remain attached to the property long after the check was deposited. The agreement had to make sense 10 years later, 20 years later, even if Blue Ridge eventually sold its development to another company. That perspective changed everything. I began thinking less about what I could receive immediately and more about what the cabin would become afterward. Could I still sit on Grandpa's porch without feeling that I had turned his land into something he would not recognize? Could the forest remain mostly intact? Would drainage from a new road threaten the creek? Would future owners of my property understand exactly what rights had been granted? Those questions became conditions, and the conditions became contract language. Blue Ridge eventually accepted a narrower easement with a defined surveyed route, specific construction and maintenance responsibilities, drainage protections, insurance obligations, restrictions on expansion, and limitations tying its use to the planned development rather than giving unlimited access to any neighboring property that might someday appear. The compensation reflected the strategic value of the access without requiring me to sell the cabin or the remainder of the acreage. Before I agreed to anything, Laura required one final title review and confirmation that the easement description matched Daniel's survey. "You have waited this long," she said. "There is no prize for becoming careless at the finish line." Grandpa would have liked her. The final meeting took place in Laura's office on a grey Thursday morning. Eric and Michael sat across from us while the completed agreement rested between two neat stacks of exhibits. I read every page again. When I reached the signature line, I stopped. Not because I was afraid to sign, but because I remembered the first purchase proposal lying on my kitchen table. Back then, everyone had been waiting for my signature as though hesitation were evidence that I did not understand money. Now I understood something more important. A signature is not the end of reading. It is the reason you read in the first place. Everything all right? Eric asked. "Yes," I said. "I am just making sure." Laura smiled slightly. I signed. Blue Ridge signed after me. The cabin remained mine. The surrounding woods remained mine. The eastern corridor remained my property, subject only to the carefully defined rights we had negotiated. When I called David afterward, he was quiet for a moment. "So it is done. The agreement is signed. And you kept the cabin?" "Yes." Grandpa would have enjoyed this. I laughed. Grandpa would have complained about how long the paperwork took. Then he would have read every page twice. That weekend, David, Susan, Rachel, and I drove to the cabin together. Winter had settled into the hills, and the trees stood bare beneath a pale afternoon sky. We walked toward the eastern boundary until we reached one of Daniel's new survey markers. David looked down the corridor toward County Road 14 and shook his head. All of this because Grandpa bought a few strange little pieces of land. Not because they were strange, I said. Because he understood what they connected. David glanced back toward the cabin through the trees. "I really did think you were throwing away a fortune over memories." "I know. Turns out you were protecting both." I did not answer immediately. The money mattered. The legal protections mattered. Keeping the cabin mattered. But what stayed with me most was how close I had come to signing away all three because the people around me were certain and I was not. When we returned to the cabin, I opened Grandpa's metal file box and placed copies of the final survey and easement beside his old deeds. I was about to close the lid when Rachel noticed another thin folder wedged beneath the earliest property records. On the tab, in Grandpa's handwriting, were two simple words, "For Maggie." I stared at it for several seconds. I had searched that box again and again, yet somehow I had never pulled that folder free. David stood beside me without saying a word as I lifted it onto the desk. For the first time since the county records had changed everything, the next thing waiting for me was not a deed, a survey, or an offer from a developer. It was something Grandpa had intended for me to find. Inside the folder was a single envelope, a copy of an old survey, and 3 pages written in Grandpa Walter's familiar handwriting. My name appeared across the front of the envelope in the same careful block letters he used on everything important. For a moment, I simply held it. David stood beside the desk, while Susan and Rachel waited near the table. Nobody told me to open it. Nobody joked about another piece of Grandpa's paperwork. That alone showed how much had changed. I finally slipped the letter from the envelope and began reading. Grandpa had written it several years before his death, while his handwriting was still steady. He explained that the cabin had never been intended to make anyone rich. He had bought it because he wanted a place where the family could gather without needing much money or planning, a place where a cup of coffee on the porch could feel like enough. Then he wrote about the land. Over the years, neighboring properties had changed owners, old agreements had disappeared, and people who once settled questions with a handshake had moved away. That was why he had started purchasing the small adjoining parcels whenever they became available. He wanted the property to have choices. He wanted future owners to control their own access instead of depending completely on whatever happened next door. There was no mention of Blue Ridge Heritage Development. There was no prediction about subdivisions, road construction, or rising land values. Grandpa had simply understood that control over land could matter as much as the land itself. One sentence made me stop reading. He wrote, "If you ever have to choose quickly because somebody else says you must, that is usually when you should slow down enough to understand what they are asking you to give away." I lowered the letter. David looked at me. "That sounds like him." "It does." I continued. Grandpa explained why the folder had my name on it. He knew I was the one most likely to keep his records organized, but he did not ask me to preserve the cabin forever. That surprised me. He wrote that houses were meant to serve people, not trap them. If keeping the cabin ever became a burden I could not reasonably carry, I should sell it without guilt. But if I sold it, he wanted me to understand every acre and every right attached to it before signing my name. The decision was mine. That mattered more to him than the decision itself. When I finished, nobody spoke for several seconds. Rachel wiped at the corner of one eye and smiled. Susan looked toward the window. David picked up the old survey and studied it again. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "You already apologized. Not for the part that actually matters." I waited. I kept acting like your hesitation meant you did not understand the situation. The truth is, I was the one who did not understand it. Neither did I at first. But you admitted that. I did not. He gave a small laugh. I was looking at the cabin. You were looking at the land. I folded Grandpa's letter carefully. Grandpa taught me to look at both. By early spring, Blue Ridge began the next stages of county review. Nothing happened overnight. Their proposed road still required engineering work and government approvals, exactly as Laura had warned me. The easement agreement did not guarantee their project would proceed, and it did not turn Grandpa's property into some magical fortune. What it did was establish clear rights if the approved development eventually used the corridor. Blue Ridge carried the construction and maintenance responsibilities we had negotiated. My ownership remained intact except for those specifically defined rights. I used part of the compensation to replace the cabin's aging roof, repair the porch, update several electrical components, and improve drainage near the driveway. I invested most of the remaining money conservatively instead of treating it like a windfall. The cabin still looked like Grandpa's cabin afterward. That was important to me. The cedar remained weathered. The stone chimney remained. His old wooden table stayed exactly where it had always been. One Saturday in April, David came up to help me repair a section of porch railing. We worked for most of the morning before sitting with coffee and looking across the trees. Do you realize what would have happened if you had listened to me that first day? He asked. I try not to think about it. You would have sold everything for $285,000. Maybe. No, you would have. I had practically put the pen in your hand. I smiled. You were persuasive. I was annoying. That too. He looked toward the eastern woods. The strange thing is, I thought the money was the whole story. So did I for a while. What changed? I thought about Grandpa's letter. I realized the best outcome was not getting Blue Ridge to pay the highest possible price. It was keeping control over what I did not need to sell. David nodded slowly. That sounds like Grandpa too. Over the following months, the family stopped referring to the place as that old cabin Maggie refused to sell. Rachel began bringing coffee when she visited. Susan helped me choose simple furniture for the repaired porch. David became the person most likely to remind me to save every new property document in Grandpa's metal box. I eventually added another folder beside Walter's original records. Inside it were Daniel Foster's certified survey, Laura's final title review, the signed easement, the appraisal, and a copy of Grandpa's letter. On the front I wrote one word, Maggie. I did not keep those papers because I expected another developer to appear. I kept them because I finally understood what Grandpa meant when he said paper remembers what people forget. People remember the cabin. They remembered Thanksgiving dinners, fishing trips, cold mornings, porch conversations, and the old man who could repair almost anything. But the county records remembered the decisions nobody had noticed. One small purchase. Then another. Then another. Quiet choices made across 15 years that preserved options for a future Grandpa could not predict. My family had laughed because I refused to make one fast decision. In the end, there was nothing particularly heroic about what I did. I simply refused to confuse urgency with wisdom. Grandpa left me 18 acres, an old cedar cabin, and a collection of paperwork most people would have thrown into a box and forgotten. The most valuable thing he left me, however, was much simpler. Before deciding what something is worth, understand exactly what you are giving away.